Welcome, welcome to this very, very special and unexpected event, and we're so pleased that Congressman Schiff is here with us. Before we start, I see so many familiar faces that I really know that I do not have to go over a long, long litany of what the National Council of Jewish Women does, but there might be one or two people here who really know nothing about us, so I'm just going to do a really quick overview to help you understand that we are an organization, a grassroots organization of volunteers and advocates, and we were just up in Sacramento advocating, and our goal is to turn progressive ideals into action. We are inspired by Jewish values, and we strive for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, families, and certainly safeguarding individual and rights and freedom. And in this council house, we do a lot of work. This is just not a council house. We have an organization called Women Helping Women. We have a group called Advocacy, those of us who advocate for changes that we think will help women and children. We have a group called Women Helping Children, who work with children in many different ways. We have our 8 thrift shops who help us raise the money so that we can provide the kind of programs that we do for the community. We have a group called Making a Difference, where volunteers get together and they take a moment, they consider a problem, and then they go in and see where they can make a difference in which part of society. And so you don't have to be a woman, you don't have to be Jewish, you just have to be a person who says, you know, I think I want to make a difference. I was raised by a mother who told me, make sure you're always making a difference. And that's sort of been my motto in life. And maybe some of you would like to make that your motto. We have all the information outside on the table. We have applications. We have all the information about all the great work that we do. On your chair, you will notice that we have a yellow evaluation card. So when the program is over, if you would take a couple of moments to evaluate the program, we'd appreciate it greatly, because we use those cards to plan other programs. We have a number of programs coming up. Again, on the back table is loads of information about all the programs. Council House has now become a year-round place where people can come for educational. We now are starting a film series. So there are many things going on, so check out outside and see if we're offering something that suits your fancy. You have 3x5 cards on your chair. Please, if you want to ask a question, write the card down. We will pick them up and we'll give the questions to Congressman Schiff. I'd like to acknowledge in the audience today Congressman Schiff's staff. Michael Aguilera is in the back. Ann Pfeiffer, right down here. Mindy Lake, an ex-student of mine from Fairfax High School, is here, representing Assemblyman Adrian Nazarian. John Darnell, is he here? In the back, great, he's representing Councilman Paul Koretz. And Stephanie Cohn, where are you, Stephanie? There you are. She represents Assemblyman Richard Bloom, who we just had a wonderful meeting with in Sacramento. I want to thank Congressman Schiff. This is a very busy time for coming here, taking time from his busy schedule. And I certainly do not want to leave out the 2 people who really keep this place running. I want to thank the Director of Advocacy, Ruth Williams, because she really knows. And then I also want to thank Hillary Sullivan, our Executive Director, who sort of keeps us all together and teaches us how to put one foot in front of the other. So without another moment, Congressman Adam Schiff.
Well, thank you very much. What a pleasure to join you. And I like this setup. I feel like I'm on NPR or one of those shows where I talk about my latest film and what we're into. So this is kind of fun. Thank you very much. I'm an admirer of the National Council, and it's wonderful to be here and have a chance to share a few thoughts with you about what's going on in Congress and what's not going on in Congress, and some of the challenges that we're facing. I thought I would give maybe a brief overview of some of the issues that we're wrestling with, and then I would love to go to your comments and questions about things. Before I do, just by way of introduction, I'm sure all of you have followed the redistricting over the course of the last year. All of our districts were quite dramatically changed. It was the result of a ballot measure which took redistricting away from the state legislature and gave it to an independent commission. And I think the commission did really quite a remarkable work. They may not have drawn the lines exactly as I would have drawn them, but then if they had, others would have complained about it. But I think they did take the politics out of it. They took the interests of the incumbents out of it. And I think they did a very credible job. Why anyone would want to be on that commission, I don't know. It was months and months of hearings up and down the state, and a really quite thankless job, but we're grateful that they did it. The new 28th Congressional District goes all the way from West Pasadena to West Hollywood, and we have some maps outside if any of you are interested in what the full parameters are, but essentially it's a district that now includes West Hollywood, Echo Park, Atwater Village, Silver Lake, Los Feliz, Burbank, Glendale, West Pasadena, La Cañada, Flint Ridge, La Crescenta Montrose, some in Tujunga, and some of the surrounding areas. So it's a north-south district. It looks quite contiguous as the crow flies. Of course, for those of us that aren't crows, there is a mountain range in the middle, but it's a wonderfully interesting, challenging, eclectic new district, and it's been wonderful and very enjoyable for me to get to know some of the new communities and some of the new constituents, and some constituents that I had 10 years ago. I used to represent the foothills, and I used to represent Silver Lake and Los Feliz and Atwater Village. So it's fun to get those areas back again, as well as some new communities. So thank you for having me. In addition to the maps, we also have constituent service guides. So if you're a new constituent of mine, it will let you know of some of the services our office has to offer. We have 2 offices. We have one in East Hollywood and one in Burbank. We have 2 locations to serve you. I feel a bit like a banker when I say that. We also have a flyer outside about a field hearing that we're going to have in a couple of weeks on an issue of concern to many of my constituents, both new and old, and that deals with the helicopter noise that we all endure here in Los Angeles. If you live in the hills, you know what I'm talking about because the sound reverberates like crazy. If you live near Lindsay Lohan, you know even more what I'm talking about, since a big part of this is the paparazzi addition to the noise problem. So if you have an interest in that, please come join us. The FAA is about to release a report on helicopter noise in Los Angeles and what it believes should be done about it. And we'll be questioning the FAA about their conclusions at this field hearing. So what's going on in Washington? Well, let me give you sort of the good news, bad news. I'll start with a much more numerous category, the bad news. Washington is unfortunately in a very dysfunctional place. Each year I think it could possibly become more dysfunctional, and each year I'm proved wrong. The most graphic recent illustration in my view was the debate we had over the gun issue after Newtown, when something that is supported by 90% of the American people couldn't pass in the Senate, even though it had a majority of votes in the Senate. This was the so-called Toomey Manchin bill. Now, to call it a universal background check bill is a very generous thing, because in fact it wasn't even universal. The system we have today is a cockamamie one in which if you go to a licensed gun dealer like a Kmart, they'll run a background check on you to make sure you're not a felon or you're not mentally ill. And if you get turned down, you can go into the parking lot of a Kmart and buy the exact same gun without a background check from someone who sells it out of the back of their truck. Now, people have called this the gun show loophole, but it's in fact much broader than gun shows. Gun shows are just one venue where you can buy guns without a background check. The reality is you can buy them anywhere, from any private party. You can buy them online. You can buy them from one website that will require a background check or another that won't. That, of course, makes no sense whatsoever. 90% of the American people think if you want to buy a gun, you ought to have a background check. Toomey Manchin expanded the requirement of background checks to gun shows and to certain online transactions, not all online transactions, but certain ones of a certain volume. But of course, that still left private sales, the guy selling out of the back of his truck, unregulated, unmonitored, and without background checks. And even that modest improvement to the background check system couldn't pass. Even that, which enjoyed the support of a majority of gun owners, even that which enjoyed the support of a majority of NRA members, couldn't pass. So to me, pretty graphic illustration of how our government is failing in its job. Also, on a broader issue, on the economy, I think that what the Congress is doing is affirmatively harmful at a time when we are poised, I think, to finally recover from the recession. We have put in place instead a sequester, a series of across-the-board cuts, really on austerity kind of a budget, which will and is dampening our recovery. So while we may be creating 100,000 or 150,000 new jobs each month, we could be creating 2 or 3 times that, I think, if the Congress would get out of the way. But we are nonetheless embarked on this sequester, cutting the good programs with the bad, and those that are most vulnerable, I think, are going to be the most harmed, because the most visible problems of the sequester, like the air traffic controllers, those are going to get fixed. But the less visible ones, people trying to get into public housing, or people trying to get the health care they need, or people trying to get their child off the wait list for Head Start, those problems are far less visible to the public, and those are going to be the most greatly impacted. So very poor public policy, having a dampening impact on our economy, making life much more precarious for those who are the most vulnerable, and I think another illustration of dysfunction in Washington, that we can't agree on a more sensible way to resolve our budgetary problems and keep our economy moving in the right direction. So let me get to the good news. The good news is immigration. Immigration, up until this past presidential election, was the most difficult issue for Congress to deal with. In my view, people feel more strongly about this issue than they do about any other. It goes to the heart of what people feel it means to be an American. And in that respect, it was and has been much more difficult than even challenges like Social Security, which was always viewed as the third rail of American politics. But the election changed everything, in the sense that I think the mainstream voices in the GOP recognized, given the very substantial margins that President Obama won, not only in the Latino community, but in just about every minority community, that unless the GOP was more welcoming and changed some of its policies in terms of minority communities in the United States, it would be perpetually locked out of the White House and would eventually be a minority party in both houses in Congress. And so the mainstream of the party, after the election, came out very strongly in favor of a comprehensive immigration reform. We now have a situation where both parties have the political will to do something about this very big, important, and previously intractable problem. In particular, what should be done about the 11 million people who are here and undocumented. So the good news is there is a very new political will that is bipartisan to fix our broken immigration system. Now, this doesn't mean that we are out of the woods. And if you were a betting person, you would bet against Congress, and most of the time you would win. The House is very treacherous ground for immigration reform. And that's most particularly true because the mainstream GOP has less of a grip on the House than it does on the Senate. In the House, someone recently described a challenge that the Speaker faces by saying the Speaker doesn't run the House, the Speaker merely runs one step ahead of the mob. And there's more than a little truth to that metaphor. It's a very difficult body to run, and it is populated by a great many members who don't want immigration reform, and they don't want gun safety bills, and they are happy to see the economy or the country forfeit its full faith and credit by not raising the debt ceiling, and they're willing to do things that are really destructive. They feel, I think, a mandate to tear down and not much of a mandate to act in a constructive way. So the challenge for immigration will be in the House. The Judiciary Committee Chairman has indicated that he will break up the immigration bill into many pieces. Now this can be a way to kill the bill by, for example, killing the pathway to citizenship for the 11 million, which would kill the bill. It also could be a very clever way of saving immigration reform by giving members of the GOP the opportunity to vote against the pieces they don't like, and then taking up the Senate bill for an up or down vote. Now that would require a departure from the so-called Hastert rule, which is a rule the majority has had of not bringing up anything that it did not enjoy a majority of GOP support. Well, immigration reform will not enjoy a majority of GOP support in the House. So the only way it will pass is with a majority of Democratic votes and a minority of Republican votes, which is probably what would happen if the Senate bill was taken up unamended. So probably the best case scenario is we have a series of votes on different pieces of immigration reform, and the House majority and the Speaker allow the Senate bill to come up for an up or down vote. So that's probably the pathway to success. And the good news is that there is a pathway to success on this issue, which there really hasn't been in the past. So those are a few of the things we've been wrestling with. There's a lot to talk about today. Those are just some of the domestic issues. Obviously, Syria is a very front and center concern. The President recently gave a major speech on terrorism. We have the Boston bombing very fresh in our recollection. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm very much looking forward to this opportunity. So I'm going to stop here, so there's a lot of time for questions, and we'd be delighted to talk about anything you'd like to today. I'll let you read them that way. I won't be accused of cherry picking the questions. My first question is, what makes you such a great congressman? Exactly.
Question number 1. If there was so much support for universal background checks in the Senate, as mentioned in your opening remarks, please explain exactly why Congress could not pass legislation for desperately needed reform on firearms.
Well, the very broad support I mentioned was not so much in the Senate as it was among the American people. So 90% of American people would support universal background checks. A majority of the American people would support doing away with extended ammunition clips, with an assault weapons ban. In the Senate, there was majority support for some of these measures. There was certainly majority support in the Senate for a universal background check bill. The problem is in the Senate, you can't pass most things of consequence with a simple majority. You have to have at least 60 votes or it can be filibustered. And the result is that a lot of things that the American people want, a lot of things that we should do, die in the Senate for lack of a supermajority. And given the closely divided nature of the Senate, and our government is going to probably be closely divided for quite a long time, this rather arcane rule in the Senate prevents a lot of things from getting passed. In the House, we like to say that the Senate is where good ideas go to die. And that certainly is true, although I have to say lately, the Senate is the place where bad ideas go to die. A lot of those bad ideas coming out of the House. But in this case, in the case of responsible gun safety measures, it's excruciatingly frustrating that even when they enjoy a majority of support in the Senate, they still can't get through. Now, I don't think this is the end of the story on gun safety, for several reasons. The first is that I don't think the Senate leader, Harry Reid, is content with the failure of universal background checks. Now, this is a tough issue in Nevada, which is his home state, but nonetheless, I think he's committed to the passage of common sense measures, and he is a very shrewd tactician. So this issue will be back. It will also be back because I think for the first time, those that support responsible gun safety measures are getting organized. And there are financial resources behind the effort, thanks to Mayor Bloomberg and his organization. So some of the resources that we've been fighting against with the NRA and with their organization are now being matched with a organized, well-funded effort on the other side. But I want to give you an illustration of why this issue is so tough. It's not just the NRA's lobbying power, although that's very considerable. It's not just the passion that its supporters hold and fall through with on election time, although that is very considerable. It's also that they tap into a sentiment that is widely held in parts of the country. And to give you an illustration, I was elected to Congress in 2000 after a very hotly contested race. And the gun issue played a prominent role in that campaign. I was running against someone who was an A-plus member of the NRA. And after the election, I was invited to speak on a panel about what was the role of the gun issue in our race. That was an election year, 2000, in which many people felt that Gore lost the presidency over the gun issue because he had been an outspoken proponent of gun safety measures, and he had lost his own home state of Tennessee, which had he won, he would have won. Of course, had he won to vote the Supreme Court, he would have won. But nonetheless, when I was asked on this panel, what's the gun issue like in your district? I said, well, in my suburban LA district, when people think about guns, it's not so much about hunting and self-protection. It's more about gang violence and drive-by shootings. It's about someone going into a Jewish community center at Granada Hills and shooting a bunch of kids, going into a schoolyard in Stockton and opening up fire with an assault weapon, both of which were fresh at the time. And when I was done, they asked one of my colleagues on the panel to talk about what the gun issue was like in his district. And my colleague was a fellow New Democrat, a freshman Democrat, from Oklahoma, named Brad Carson, very bright guy, Rhodes Scholar. And Brad said, well, in my Oklahoma district, when people think about guns, it's also not so much about hunting or self-protection. It's about Lexington and Concord. It's about Lexington and Concord. And I had to pause for a moment to think, what about Lexington? But then, of course, it was apparent that for his Oklahoma constituents, the right to bear arms was part and parcel of what it meant to be an American, a part of the American Revolution, part of our heritage, the right to bear arms even against your own government should it become a hostile government. And there is that sentiment that the NRA taps throughout the country, which is part of the reason why they're formidable. So we need to acknowledge that it's not just their money and not just their ground troops, but we also have to be well organized and be passionate about this issue as their followers are. If we can't do something in the wake of a nightmare as horrific as Newtown, I don't know when we can.
Okay, question number 2. Why hasn't the administration done a better job of explaining the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare? We allow the Republicans to demonize the legislation. How can we turn this around, and how can I help? And this is obviously a constituent of yours, because she said, we miss you in Pasadena. So.
Yes, well, thank you. It's a good question, and frankly, this has been a challenge ever since the healthcare debate began. The opposition was well organized and vocal, and they've stayed that way. And part of it is with any complicated change and reform, it's much more easy to caricature and vilify than it is to explain. And when the burden of explanation is on you, it is a very tough challenge. But I think we are seeing, and for example, just recently, when California unveiled what the premiums will be in the health insurance exchange, and in fact, those premiums were very reasonable. And a great many of the providers, all the major ones, I think 13 providers are participating. All of the hyperbole about, well, the rates are going to be astronomical and no one's going to want to participate in health exchanges is being pretty clearly, convincingly debunked. And that's what's going to have to happen. The ultimate way we are going to prove the naysayers wrong is with a successful reform. But the administration does need to do a much better job pushing out good information, and the president needs to be out there in front doing it, because nobody has a stronger bully pulpit than he does. And it's going to require a sustained campaign, because it's awfully sustained on the other side. But this has been a real challenge, and I certainly understand the frustration. But I think, as seniors have come to recognize that they're getting better prescription drug benefits, the donut hole is getting eliminated in coverage. As parents are coming to realize they can keep their kids on their policies up till age 26. As people with pre-existing conditions are finding they can now get health care coverage, more and more people are seeing the benefits of the health care reform, and that's not even the 32 million people who are going to be able to get health care coverage that couldn't get it before. So I think we're starting to see all the benefits. I'll tell you about one very revealing conversation I had on this subject. Not long after the passage of the bill, I did a sidewalk office hours in the Glendale Galleria. And I heard all the death squads and all the other hyperbole about the healthcare reform, but I had not heard this before, and it was really quite shocking to me. And this came after I did one of the infamous now town halls on healthcare, where we had 3,000 people come out down Amber. Some of you were here that braved that storm. But anyway, I'm in the Glendale Galleria. Someone comes up to me, it's after the vote on the healthcare reform, and he says, I just have one question for you. How did you vote on that Obamacare? Well, you can tell from the question where this is coming from. And I said, I voted for it. And he said, okay, I will never vote for you again. Ever. Ever. As if the first two evers were not enough. And I said, well, okay, I understand where you're coming from. And then he started to walk away, and he turned around and said, do you mind if I ask you one other question? I said, no, that's why I'm here. What could you possibly have liked? What could you possibly have liked about that bill? And I said, well, there were a lot of things I liked about it, and I talked about how I liked the idea that people with pre-existing conditions could get health insurance. Love one of my constituents who said, I'm 68, I am a pre-existing condition. I liked the fact that kids could stay on their parents' policy. I went through the things I liked about it. And then I said, I like the fact that 32 million people that haven't been able to afford health insurance can get health insurance. And he said, you really think that's such a good idea? And this I hadn't heard before. And it took me aback. And I said, well, yes, I do. Don't you? And he said, no, I don't. If they can't afford it, they shouldn't have it. And I realized the moment he said it, that he was expressing a sentiment held by millions of others who would never say it publicly. And even at the town hall where people were, holding placards showing Obama looking like Hitler, they wouldn't say the real reason why they were opposing it, which is if they can't afford it, they shouldn't have it. I just think that healthcare is such an essential. In a country as prosperous as ours, we have a moral obligation to make sure everyone has access to health care. And I think that's one of the primary benefits of the bill.
Here are two questions on Sirius, so I'm sort of going to put them together. I'm opposed to the use of drones. What is your position? And then instead of spending money on Syria, why can't we use that money at home for education, job training, Head Start? And then the other question that goes with it is,
Speak into the microphone.
I'm sorry, what are the vital deals or legislation pending on Syria? So,
Okay. Well, let me talk about Syria first, and then let me talk about drones. I don't know that there are actually bills pending on Syria, but there are many that are urging, and John McCain is one of the foremost, that we establish a no-fly zone in Syria. Others have been urging that we supply weapons to the opposition in Syria. I think the president has been very properly circumspect about getting further involved in Syria. And I think it's right for him to be cautious about getting dragged into something which started out as the legitimate aspiration of a people to have a say in their governance, but has now become a sectarian civil war. The fight now in Syria is largely between Sunnis and Shiites. And we have a very poor track record of engagement and involvement in sectarian civil wars. And we should be very, very careful not to be drawn into another one. So the president is right to, I think, hold off these calls, analyze this carefully, and at this point, I don't agree with the calls to provide legal assistance or certainly or to establish a no-fly zone, which holds the prospects of the downing of American pilots, the necessity of having ground forces available to retrieve those pilots. It's easy to get in, we have found. It is very tough to get out once you do. Now, what makes this such a agonizing issue to confront is that the casualties are horrific. There are tens of thousands of people who have been killed. There's no sign of the conflict abating. Russia is doing everything it can to scuttle attempts to get to a negotiated solution. And the prospects for a peaceful outcome are few and far between. So it is very hard for us to watch this horrible loss of life. But it's not clear that our further involvement by providing lethal weapons, by establishing a no-fly zone or other actions would shorten the conflict, because there's one conflict until Assad falls, and he will fall. There's another conflict once he does fall, about who will govern Syria afterwards. We have to be, I think, mindful of the limitations of our power to control those events. So I think the president is treating this exactly as he should, and not rushing to heed the calls from those who want to engage us in another civil war. In terms of the drone issue, I really think that issue is much broader than drones. I think it's more an issue of the use of lethal force. And the reason why I don't think we should fixate completely on drones is if we weren't using drones, or if we put a prohibition on the use of drones, then we would be using cruise missiles. And if we weren't using cruise missiles, we would be using smart bombs, which is a bit of an oxymoron. It's not so much the weapon platform that is the issue. The issue is the use of lethal force justified? Under what circumstances? In what places? Does the authorization to use military force that we passed in the wake of 9/11, that authorizes the use of force against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates that were responsible for 11, is that a legal basis for the use of lethal force against groups that weren't even in existence on 9/11? Now, those are broader questions than whether one military platform or another should be utilized. There are strategic questions about the drones which are unique to them. The strategic questions are, on the one hand, they allow you to take people off the battlefield who are trying to kill us. On the other hand, when you kill innocent people in the process, you create new jihadis who dedicate themselves to killing us. And I think we are becoming much more aware of the strategic costs. We've always been aware of the strategic benefits, and as the President said at National Defense University, we can't ignore the fact that they have been very successful in helping us seriously degrade the core of Al-Qaeda. Part of the reason why Al-Qaeda is not in a position to launch the kind of massive attack we had on 9/11 is that the drones have been successful in eliminating most of the top leadership of Al-Qaeda. So what the President said the other day, and I think he's right, we're at a crossroads. The threat we faced on 9/11 is not the same threat we face today, but we do face a threat. It's not from a top-down core Al-Qaeda leadership. It is instead now from Al-Qaeda franchises like AQAP and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. It's from Al-Nusra in Syria, which is now affiliated with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's these franchises, some closely affiliated, some loosely affiliated, some affiliated only because they want the money, some affiliated because they want the prestige, some that their reason for being is a local grudge that has nothing to do with the United States or the West, some who have bought into the idea of an extended caliphate and find terrorist attacks on the West useful for raising money and raising manpower. So the President's right, we're at a crossroads. And I think the President's also right, we ought to close Guantanamo. I guess looking at the glass half full, notwithstanding the GOP reaction, which has been, of course, hostile to the President's speech, there have been a few voices, and McCain's among them, who expressed a willingness to close Guantanamo, provided we have some plan for what we do with the people who are in it. I think the President alluded to some of the difficulties there. Some of the people at Gitmo will be sent back to their countries of origin. Some can be prosecuted in the criminal court system, some can be prosecuted before military tribunals, but there is yet a category that cannot be prosecuted because the evidence is either tainted or derived from sources that can't be disclosed, that can't be sent back to the country where they came from. And that group of people is the most stubborn and difficult challenge remaining. But the fact that the problem is difficult doesn't mean that we can ignore it. And one of the things that I've been working on is legislation that would sunset the authorization to use military force at the time we had drawn down our troops at the end of next year from Afghanistan. It would call upon the President and Congress to figure out not only what to do with the Guantanamo detainees who remain, but also whether any additional authorization to use force is necessary beyond 2014, and if so, how narrowly tailored it should be. So those are some of the challenges that we face.
Okay. This is a long one.
The problem is not with the length of the questions. The problem is with the length of the answers. So I'll try to be a little bit more brief.
Congressman Adam Schiff, are you willing to meet and dialogue with Congressman Bobby Scott and Senator Dianne Feinstein to compromise on a bill that will go to the House of Representatives and the United States Senate and be passed and signed into law by the President? Example, Gang Abatement and Prevention Act of 2007 and the Youth Promise Act. If yes, we can arrange a meeting through Congresswoman Karen Bass.
Well, the answer is absolutely yes, and I work very closely, obviously, with Senator Feinstein and with Bobby Scott. I'm a co-sponsor of the Youth Promise Act and appreciate all the good work Bobby has done on that. And I've worked very closely with Senator Feinstein on the gang issue and co-sponsored legislation with her also. One other bill that I would love to engage whoever the questioner was, that I'm working with Tony Cardenas on. When Tony and I were in the state legislature together, we authored a bill called the Schiff Cardenas Crime Prevention Act of 2000. That was a bill that dedicated the same amount of resources to at-risk youth and violence prevention as it invested in the COPS program. The idea was that we would invest in prevention, a like amount that we're investing in suppression. That has been a very successful formula, and over the years, it has resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars going into at-risk youth efforts and crime prevention efforts. And one of the key parts of that bill was an assessment component, because we wanted to make sure that these resources were being wisely spent on programs that worked, and then that those successful efforts could be replicated, and efforts that didn't work, where the only evidence was anecdotal, we could jettison in favor of fact-based, data-based juvenile reinvestment strategies. Tony and I are now working on this in Congress. Last session, before Tony got there, I introduced a bill that I called Cops and Kids that reauthorized juvenile justice programs and the COPS programs, again, to a similar authorization level. And Tony and I are now working on this. We have joined forces again, so I would also like to engage your help and support on that effort.
All right, what is your position on fracking and its impact on the environment and overuse of the limited water resources in the process?
Well, I'm not a supporter of fracking, and I'm an opponent of the Keystone Pipeline. Energy is an area where, in my view, all of our interests point in the same direction. It's an issue where if we get it right, it's an unmitigated winner, and if we get it wrong, it's a dead loser across every area. What I mean by that is, if we can wean ourselves off of foreign oil, if we can significantly diminish our reliance on fossil fuels generally, it is a national security winner for us. It means that the oil resources that Iran relies on to fund Hezbollah dry up. It means the bully stick that Russia can use, its petroleum club, that it uses against the Baltic states, or that it can use to prop up its failed economy and support military interventions in places like Syria, dries up. It means the power of the Hugo Chavez's of the world dry up. By diminishing the value of that oil resource, it's a national security winner. It's an economic winner for us if we can be the leaders in renewable energy and new technologies. I remember going to hear the CEO of Google several years ago, and he made a very interesting point on this subject by saying that the revolution in telecommunications that we've seen over the last 2 decades will be dwarfed in significance by the revolution that has already begun in energy. And whatever nation leads that transformation, since this is a much bigger segment of our economy than telecommunications, whatever country leads that transformation will lead economically. And I want that to be the United States. So the answer is not more Keystone pipelines, transporting oil from one country to our port to go to other countries, and endangering our environment in the process. The answer is investing in renewable energy and new technologies. It's obviously an environmental imperative. It's a climate change imperative. It's a health imperative, in addition to being an economic and national security imperative. So, in my view, all of these vectors point in the same direction, which is an Apollo project-like determination to wean ourselves away from fossil fuels. I would certainly put fracking at the top of that list.
Okay, 2 questions on sequestration. This person is worried that sequestration is further cut in terms of the funding that they are getting. So what do you know about that? And then what specific changes are you advocating regarding the sequestration, and what can we do to help?
Well, I think the sequestration is about the worst economic policy that we could come up with, because it's an indiscriminate set of cuts that will disproportionately fall on the most vulnerable people. We're already at levels of domestic discretionary spending we haven't seen since the Eisenhower administration. And what that means, in addition to imperiling our most vulnerable, is that we can't invest in education, we can't invest in infrastructure. I mean, how many bridges need to collapse before we do something about it? And why not do something about it now, when we could use the jobs in the construction industry? So sequestration is going to mean a diminished investment in our future. It's going to mean imperiling people who are already on the precipice, and it's going to dampen our economic recovery. So it's a dead loser. So what do we do instead? What we do instead is we legislate a balanced plan to reduce our deficits, to pay down our debt, to put us on a more solid fiscal footing, and over a responsible timeline. We just need to look at Europe to see that austerity policies are a failure. That is not the direction we want to go in. It'll mean that there are some additional cuts that are going to be necessary. And that pain will have to be shared by the Defense Department. But it also means new revenues are going to be necessary. That shouldn't be that difficult. It's not rocket science. It's not as pleasant as when you're washing resources and you're trying to decide how to invest them. But it's also not as difficult as it appears if you have reasonable people who are willing to get to yes. So that's what I think we should replace the sequester with, is a balanced set of reductions where we can make them, where they need to be made, phased in over time so they don't suppress our recovery, coupled with new revenues, doing away with some of the special interest tax deductions like that enjoyed by the oil industry, which are obscene given the financial need that is there, and given that we're incentivizing exactly the wrong economic sectors.
All right, all right. Just single questions now. Will you sign on to the Grace and Chicano letter that says you won't vote for any budget that has any cuts to Social Security in it? I'm not a believer in the pledges of one kind or another. I don't like the Grover Norquist no new taxes pledge, and I'm not familiar with the details of Mr. Grayson's, but if it's a similar absolute position, it's probably not one I would want to sign. I will say this on the subject of Social Security. I have written to the President to take strong issue with his proposal to inaugurate a chained CPI. I think this is a very bad idea, and I urge the administration, even before the President put it in the budget, not to put it in the budget, for several reasons. First of which is it's bad policy. And those of you that may not be familiar with the chained CPI, we use a certain method to calculate the cost of living increases that people on Social Security get. Well, some economists believe that that overstates the cost of living for seniors, and that a chained CPI would be more accurate. And the theory is that even though the cost of things may be going up along the lines of our current COLA, when it goes up in that way, people choose to substitute goods. So oranges may be going up, but that doesn't mean that seniors will buy the more expensive oranges. They might substitute for apples, which haven't gone up. And therefore, you don't need to increase the COLA quite as much because people substitute goods. The problem with this theory is that many of the greatest expenditures for seniors are non-substitutable. They're medicines, they're rent, they're fixed costs. And presuming that they can substitute at will, like maybe more of the general population, may give you a very inaccurate, a much more inaccurate estimate of the cost of living. But whatever the ultimate economic answer is, the bottom line is, it's a cut in benefits. So any way you want to frame it, whether it's a more accurate or a less accurate way of calculating the cost of living, it is a benefit cut by any other definition. And this is to a group that has become very dependent on Social Security. Now, Social Security wasn't intended to be the sole source of retirement, but for many Americans it is. And many of the people on Social Security are really struggling to get by. And at a time when we're not asking that much of the hedge fund billionaires, because we can't even treat their carried interest as ordinary income, I don't think we should be asking seniors to get less for their medicine. So I think it's bad policy. I also think that politically it's a mistake for the President to have included it in the budget. It was done, I think, with the premise that this would show his good faith willingness to make hard decisions that would be reciprocated by the other side. Well, that assumes you have someone interested in
reciprocity. But there isn't. And the minute he puts that on the table, that doesn't become the bargain, it becomes the floor for discussion. So strategically, I think it was a mistake. I'll mention one other thing on the subject of strategy, and that is Bowles-Simpson was an effort to come up with a bipartisan plan for deficit reduction. It was a very conservative work product that relied much more on cuts than it did on new revenues. But people criticized the president. Why didn't he embrace Bowles-Simpson? The reason he didn't embrace Bowles-Simpson is that the minute he embraces Bowles-Simpson, it does not become the deal, it becomes the floor for negotiation. And that was a very conservative floor. I remember going on Fox, and I was in the green room waiting to go on, and Mike Croppo, a senator from Idaho, was in the green room at the same time. He was part of the Gang of Six in the Senate, a bipartisan group that came up with something similar to Simpson-Bowles. And he said, "You know what really killed us?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "When the president says something nice about our work, that just killed us." And that's the reality, which is anything he embraces becomes immediately unacceptable to the other side, which is part of the reason why he is, I think, responsibly kept a distance from the immigration debate. But it's also why I think it's unfair to criticize him for not embracing some of these conservative work products, because they would only become the basis of negotiation, not the ultimate deal.
You ready to go on?
I'm ready.
Good. Okay, last June you introduced a constitutional amendment to reverse the Supreme Court's ruling on Citizens United. What do you think is the likelihood that we see a constitutional amendment passed in Congress that reverses the Supreme Court's ruling?
Well, this is a very tall order. It's difficult to amend the Constitution for a reason. Part of the reason is that there are a lot of bad ideas about how to amend the Constitution, and you don't want it to be easy. It took a long time for me to frankly get to the point where I thought a constitutional amendment on this subject was a worthwhile pursuit, for the reason that I am apprehensive about opening the door to constitutional amendment. But I became convinced that this growth of super PACs, the changing nature of campaign finance, have become such a threat to the health of our democracy. That's the one thing I have seen since I've been in elective office that does justify amending the Constitution if we can't get a different Supreme Court. And the problem is broader than the Citizens United decision. In Citizens United, the court did quite infamously decide that corporations were people for the purposes of the First Amendment. Now that's an appalling and illogical conclusion, to put it politely. But the problem goes back many years before Citizens United. It goes back all the way to a decision called Buckley versus Vallejo. In the Buckley case, which is about 30 years old, the Supreme Court struck down part of a post-Watergate reform. After Watergate, Congress passed campaign finance laws that limited not only contributions, but also independent expenditures. And the Supreme Court in Buckley said, well, a contribution to a candidate or office holder has the potential of corrupting, and therefore there's a compelling state interest in being able to regulate this. And so we will allow that. But an independent expenditure couldn't possibly corrupt, wouldn't ever give the appearance of corruption, and therefore we are going to hold that to be unconstitutional. There's no compelling state interest in regulating independent expenditures. But the court said, should events prove us wrong, we will re-examine this. Now events have most definitely proved them wrong. It is, I think, preposterous that a casino magnate like Sheldon Adelson is limited in giving Newt Gingrich $5,000 directly, but can spend $20 million on his presidential campaign on the same ads. And to suggest that Newt Gingrich was unaware that Sheldon Adelson was single-handedly funding his presidential campaign, and that would be somehow less corrupting than if Sheldon simply gave him $20 million, is preposterous. No one, well, I would say no one on earth would buy that, except there are 5 people who do. And unfortunately for us, they happen to be on the Supreme Court. And unless that changes, it will be necessary to amend the Constitution. The chances are overwhelmingly difficult to do it. There is something we can do and should do in the interim, though, and it's called the Disclose Act, which would require disclosure of contributions. And one other thing I'll mention on this subject is what the IRS did in targeting the Tea Party groups is completely inappropriate, unacceptable, and illegal. Now, I don't think this is the first time they've done it, and I raised this issue during the last administration when they targeted All Saints Church and the black churches and Greenpeace and the NAACP. So I think this is a broader issue than just one administration. But one of the things that is very important not to lose sight of in this is the section at issue 501c4, this social welfare organization section, is being abused by these super PACs. It is a scam, and we need the IRS to vigorously enforce this law. And it would be a terrible result if the illegal, inappropriate, and other actions taken by this group will so chill the IRS's willingness to enforce the law that they don't enforce it the way they should and the way they must. The reason why, Karl Rove started this super PAC to influence the last presidential election, but some of his donors didn't want to be disclosed. So he started a sister organization, a social welfare organization, that could also bash the president, but as long as it didn't spend 51% of its money bashing the president, could claim to be a social welfare group and hide its donors. That is a terrible abuse of something which used to have a legitimate purpose. There actually were social welfare groups, but now it is just a shield to hide donors who are doing the same political hack work as the super PACs that are overtly involved in the political process. And I think we ought to either repeal that section, or we ought to provide that any political activity by those groups disqualifies them from the both tax-exempt status as well as the ability to hide their donors.
Okay, can you please explain why Obama isn't releasing innocent detainees from Guantanamo? He needs no support from Congress to do so.
Well, Congress has prohibited him, at least for the moment, from detaining people in the United States that are given him. Congress has also imposed a requirement that people cannot be repatriated back to their country of origin, and a lot of the detainees are Yemeni, unless the president can certify that it won't be a threat to national security. The problem is that a lot of the people, not a majority, but many of the people that have been released from Gitmo, many of which were released under the prior administration, have returned to the fight. So the threat is not illusory. It's one of the things that makes the problem so thorny. Now, I don't know that you can say that there are innocent people at Guantanamo. There are people at Guantanamo for which the evidence that you would use against them can't be used in a court of law because the way that evidence was derived, sometimes from classified sources or sources that would be disclosed if the evidence was introduced, and some because it may have been a product of torture. So it's a difficult problem, but is there more the administration could be doing? And the answer is yes. Is there more the administration should have been doing over the last few years? The answer to that is also yes. There was someone that was evaluating the detainees on a case-by-case basis to determine who should be released, who should be repatriated. That person left that job, and I got to imagine of all the thankless, horrible jobs in the world, that's got to be the worst because, of course, anyone you release who rejoins the fight comes back on your doorstep. That position has gone unfilled. The president is now recommitting to filling that position and once again beginning the process of analyzing what detainees can be repatriated, what detainees can be prosecuted, what detainees can be tried in commissions, and what detainees can be released. So that is overdue. Those gears are now back in motion. And most importantly, I hope there will be a receptivity to discussions between the President, Senators like McCain and others, who have now expressed their willingness to close Guantanamo, provided that we can agree on a plan for what ought to be done with the remaining detainees. I would hope that we can get to yes here. I think Guantanamo has been a terrible black eye to us. It's been a rallying cry for those who mean us ill, and it really should be closed.
Okay, leaving Guantanamo. Same-sex marriage has passed in 6 states. Do you see a day in the near future when the other 44 states will accept it? And what do you think the Supreme Court's decision will be in June?
Well, the answer is yes, I do see a day when all 50 states will make marriage equality the law of their lands. And I see a day when the United States will also, and I hope that day comes soon with the Supreme Court. In terms of what I see the Supreme Court doing, there are a couple of very key cases before the court, one challenging DOMA, another challenging California's Prop 8. And there's been some recent commentary by people who are better Supreme Court watchers than I am, that what the court may do on Prop 8 is decide not to hear the case, that the parties lack standing to be before the court. It's unclear what the full impact of that would be, whether it would only affect the parties to the litigation or it would affect everyone in California. My own sense is it would affect everyone in California, and marriage equality would become the law of the land in California. Is that the best case result? It is probably the next to best case. The best case would be the Supreme Court takes up the case and strikes down Prop 8 with a reasoning that holds that marriage equality is a constitutional right in the state of California. That would be the best case scenario. I don't know that we should expect the best case. And the other decision of vital importance is DOMA, and whether the court strikes that down and on what basis they strike it down. I don't know what to think about our chances there. I think they're probably close to 50-50. I think on the one hand, you have justices like our Chief Justice who are very conscious of their legacy and who are very aware of the rapid changes in the country in terms of the public view on marriage equality. And there has been just a phenomenal progression of one barrier after another coming down, which has been incredibly encouraging. And so a Chief Justice who is thinking about his place in history is going to be thinking, do I want to be the Chief Justice who was the last justice standing for marriage inequality and discrimination? When this is all swept away from the land, and 50 years and 100 years from now, do I want that to be my legacy? And I have to think that he won't want that to be his legacy. But he already stuck his neck out on the health care reform. And I don't know whether he's going to be willing to stick it out again on marriage equality. So I don't know that I can give you a good handicapping on it, but it's certainly my hope that it's struck down. On this issue, let me mention one other thing that is a very contemporary issue affecting the LGBT community, and that is immigration reform.
Yes.
One of the most difficult pieces of immigration reform is ending the discrimination against the LGBT community, who can't take advantage of family-based immigration the way other families can. And my concern is that this inequality will be perpetuated in the immigration reform. There was an opportunity in the Senate Judiciary Committee to amend the proposal of the Gang of Eight to provide equality. That amendment was not offered. Ultimately, I think it was the conclusion of the Senate leadership that it would kill the bill. I don't know whether it would have killed the bill or not. I raised this issue with Senator Schumer and urged him as one of the leaders on this immigration proposal to do everything in his power to make sure that that equality is a part of our immigration reform. because I think it would be a tragic result at a time when all these barriers are coming down for us to institutionalize one of them in the area of immigration. It's my hope on the Senate floor that an amendment will be offered and it will be passed. And I have to think and hope that our leadership is strategizing a floor strategy, a conference committee strategy, whatever strategy is necessary to make this a part of the final result. Now, should the court strike down DOMA, that may answer that question for us, in which case the failure to include equality in the immigration bill will be constitutionally insupportable. But I don't want to hang my hat on the Supreme Court. So I'm going to certainly do everything I can to make sure that the Uniting Families Act or provisions like it are part of the final immigration bill program.
Okay, we have just 5 minutes left, so I'm picking questions now that are sort of different than the ones that have been asked before. This one certainly is relevant because I just watched it on the news last night. So it says, as you probably know, Colorado and Washington voters approved measures in November election to take marijuana off the criminal market and try it and tax it for legal use by adults 21 years old or older. Do you support HR 1523, which would exempt people from the CSA if they comply with the state marijuana law? And for those of you who want to learn about it, I have to say Rachel Maddow had a great show on this particular issue last night with Hickenlooper, the governor of Colorado, as he signed the bill.
You know, I'm not familiar with precisely what's in that bill, but I can say this. I don't think the federal government should be using its law enforcement resources to prosecute people where a state has decided that it wants marijuana to be legal. The context in which this issue has come up in the past, and this will change now with what Colorado and Washington has done, is in the Appropriations Committee where I served for many years now, there have been amendments offered, all of which I have supported, to defund the Justice Department's enforcement actions against people using medicinal marijuana. I think the federal government has got better things to do than prosecuting people who believe marijuana helps their medical conditions, alleviates their pain, and deals with their glaucoma, or deals with their helps them in their cancer therapy. There's, I think, ample medical evidence that medical marijuana works, but more importantly, there's the evidence of everyday constituents who I talk to who tell me it's the only thing that has worked to relieve the pain for them. And if it works for them, I don't want to make a criminal out of them. So I don't think the federal government should be involved in prosecuting people for use of medical marijuana. And I don't think that the federal government ought to be involved in prosecuting people in states where the state has made the decision to legalize it. One of the things that, was sort of a founding principle of the country is that we have 50 laboratories in the states. Now, I don't know how those experiments are going to work in Washington and Colorado. Maybe they will be successful in taking organized crime and the money out and regulating marijuana the way we regulate alcohol. They may be complete successes and they may not be. We'll certainly find out. But I don't think the federal government ought to be investing the few resources we have in prosecuting people in either of those states. And I hope that's what the Justice Department ultimately concludes.
All right, and the last question is, in as few words as possible, please show us how much you're going to miss Michelle Bachmann.
I just did.